Welcome back to Plain Sight Docs. Tonight, we're reopening a government file sealed for over 60 years. In 1959, 9 experienced hikers ventured into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. Their goal? The prestigious Grade 3 certification. Led by Igor Dyatlov, they were well prepared for the brutal cold. But they never returned. When their campsite was discovered, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a forensic impossibility. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Their survival gear, boots, coats, axes, was left behind. Why would seasoned hikers flee their shelter, underdressed, into freezing temperatures? The first bodies were found a mile away, near a dead fire, barefoot, and in sleeping clothes. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints other than theirs, and no animal attacks. A few months later, the remaining hikers were found with massive internal injuries, yet no external wounds. Some had traces of radiation on their clothes. The investigation was abruptly shut down, and the cause of death recorded as an overwhelming unknown force. Tonight, we dig into the facts, explore the lost journal entries, and uncover the chilling mystery of Dyatlov Pass. And if you want more stories hidden in plain sight, make sure to subscribe before we descend any deeper. First witness. The Colonial Parkway was a masterpiece of mid-century landscape architecture. A quiet retreat where the only potential disturbance was the rustle of leaves or the ebb of the river tide. This quietude, which felt like a sacred promise to local residents, was violently shattered in the early hours of October 12, 1986. The crime itself had occurred days earlier, transforming a picturesque historic site into a hidden, brutal monument to terror. It began with the agonizing process of reporting 2 young women missing, Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Kathy, 27, was a highly disciplined and ambitious Navy ensign, a woman whose life was built on structure and adherence to schedule, carving out a career in a demanding field station nearby. Rebecca, 21, was a promising student at the College of William and Mary, focused on her studies. They had been seen leaving a campus computer lab late on the night of October 9, 1986. Then silence. A silence that was not instantaneous, but stretched across days, confusing authorities and costing critical time. The family's fear was palpable and immediate, fueled by the knowledge that these were not impulsive individuals. Kathy Thomas, with her Navy training, was not someone to deviate from a plan. Rebecca Dowski would not simply abandon her life. They did not simply disappear. The initial delay in classifying the case as a potential homicide, a delay rooted in the initial assumption of a runaway situation, tragically influenced by bias regarding the victim's lifestyle, was a catastrophic early failure. This delay allowed the crime scene to cool and potential tracking dogs to lose the scent in the damp, cool autumn air. The silence around their vanishing was a shield for the killer, reinforced by police bias and a shocking lack of initial urgency. The critical first 48 hours, the golden window of any homicide investigation, were utterly squandered by assumptions and bureaucratic inertia. 3 days later, the search focused on one of the isolated gravel turnoffs of the Colonial Parkway. It was there, pushed down a steep embankment near a dense thicket of trees, that a Park Service ranger discovered Kathy Thomas, white, 1980 Honda Civic. The scene was deeply unsettling, not because of what was missing, but because of what was contained within the small space of that sedan. The car was locked. There was no sign of a forced entry, no shattered glass, no evidence of a dramatic struggle that would alarm others nearby. It was neat. Too neat. This clinical precision spoke of a killer who achieved absolute control instantly, without a need for chaos. He had subdued them quickly, likely using surprise or the immediate threat of a weapon the instant he encountered them in the car. The small interior, often seen as a place of refuge and intimacy, became a claustrophobic torture chamber. When the officers managed to access the vehicle, they found the 2 women dead, positioned in a manner that defied the typical chaos of a crime scene. Their bodies showed evidence of extreme violence. They had been strangled and severely cut. The violence seemed personal, perhaps even ritualistic, but the setting was utterly impersonal. The killer had meticulously managed a terrifying act within the confines of a compact car in absolute darkness. The positions of the bodies suggested a deliberate staging, an intent to communicate a message of dominance and violation to the first person who would discover them. The killer spent time in the car basking in the aftermath, ensuring his signature was clear, demonstrating a level of detachment that chilled even hardened investigators. Crucially, key elements were present at the scene that should have immediately screamed serial predator. Both women had been bound with rope, and forensic examination found evidence of a specialized nautical knot used near the scene. This detail suggested the killer had a specific skill set, or perhaps even a trade connected to sailing, climbing, or the Navy, a detail hinting at a calculated methodology that police for days failed to exploit. The type of rope was also distinctive, often used for boats or heavy outdoor rigging, an item not found in a typical commuter's car. The investigation should have immediately focused on local marinas, military bases, or boating communities. Instead, these specific unique identifiers were simply catalogued and left to sit. The lack of priority given to this crucial signature evidence was a direct result of the fractured investigation, and the car had been deliberately driven to this final spot and pushed down the embankment, driven by the killer himself after the murders were complete. This was not a passive abandonment. It was an act of final, deliberate concealment, suggesting the killer had intimate knowledge of the immediate terrain, knowing exactly where to hide a car so it would not be spotted from the main road. This act, taking command of the victim's vehicle and staging the scene, demonstrated a level of terrifying confidence. It suggested the killer was not a passing opportunist, but someone who viewed the entire landscape as his personal theater. He was controlling the very parameters of the police investigation before it even began, choosing where they would look and what they would see. The fact that he was audacious enough to spend time arranging the bodies in the car after the murder, all on a federally protected roadway, speaks to an utter lack of fear of detection. The killer understood that the perceived isolation of the parkway was his greatest ally, providing both darkness and a buffer against professional police response. However, the initial investigation was fractured from the beginning, a fatal consequence of the multi-jurisdictional setting. The murder had taken place on federal land, making the National Park Service, NPS, the lead investigative agency, but they were woefully under-equipped for a complex homicide case. The FBI was slow to classify it as a serial crime. State and local police, who had the experience, were relegated to supporting roles, creating immediate bureaucratic friction. The Virginia State Police, VSP, and the FBI were often at loggerheads, arguing over jurisdiction, protocol, and investigative leads, all while the crime scene cooled. The investigation was not driven by urgency, but by institutional rivalry, a condition the killer likely understood and exploited. This turf war was perhaps the greatest single gift the killer received, ensuring no one agency was fully accountable for the forensic failures. This jurisdictional confusion had fatal consequences. The crime scene was immediately compromised. Federal Park Police, unfamiliar with complex homicide processing, allowed essential evidence, hair fibers, potential fingerprints, to be either mishandled or allowed to degrade in the damp, cool weather of the fall. The technology of the 1980s was already limited. The procedural errors compounded that weakness. Any viable DNA evidence that may have been left was likely wiped out by contamination or poor collection techniques. The physical evidence was lost to the initial chaos and the subsequent bureaucratic delay. The focus of the initial police interview, rather than targeting suspicious individuals in the area, centered tragically on the victim's relationship, a tragic distraction fueled by bias that cost precious hours and days. The killer, if he was watching the news, knew he had been handed a head start. The failure to secure and process the scene, according to strict protocol, essentially handed the killer a lifetime pass as evidence chain of custody was hopelessly broken. The investigators found themselves in a forensic vacuum. They had no physical evidence that could point to an external actor save for the rope. The tragedy of the Thomas Dowski case became a template for how not to manage a complex murder scene, a failure that would haunt the region for decades. The FBI was eventually forced to take the lead, classifying the case not just as a double homicide, but as a potential serial pattern. This belated recognition came at immense cost. The investigation stalled. The initial terror subsided into a grim cold case. The parkway's overlooks were closed at night, a hollow gesture that did little to soothe the pervasive anxiety clinging to the region. It felt like a warning had been issued, and the community was holding its breath, praying that the shadow had passed. But the shadow had simply retreated into the deep corners of the state. For almost a year, the parkway was quiet. The killer was invisible. The police had failed to look outside the parameters of the initial crime scene, creating a linkage blindness that the killer would exploit again and again. They were looking for a killer who only struck naval officers or students on the parkway. The killer was proving he owned the entire region and could adapt his methods at will. The failure to connect the crime to a broader roaming predatory nature was the core of the 1986 failure. The tension in the region was palpable, an invisible shroud of dread hanging over every car that parked after sunset. Locals knew something fundamental had broken. The murder of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski was a declaration their secluded sanctuary was now a dark territory. The unspoken question that hung in the humid air was, how did the killer gain access to a locked car containing two physically capable victims? Profilers hypothesized the initial interaction must have been nonviolent. Perhaps the killer posed as an authority figure like a park ranger or plainclothes officer, using the darkness and isolation to his advantage. This theory explains the lack of external struggle. The victim's potential compliance in the seconds before the deadly assault began. Then, in September 1987, the shadow returned, proving the predator had not left, only widened his reach and altered his signature just enough to throw off the localized police forces. The second pair vanished. David Knobling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14, disappeared in September 1987. David was home from college, taking Robin, his girlfriend, out for a drive. David, a respected local, and Robin, a teenager, presented a completely different victim profile from the first pair, further confusing the authorities. They were last seen together, their vehicle found not on the Colonial Parkway, but at the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge boat ramp, a desolate, isolated expanse of tidal water and thick woods, connected by remote county roads to the parkway's overall dark territory. On September 21st, David's black Ford Ranger truck was found abandoned at the boat ramp. The scene was different yet disturbingly familiar. The truck was unlocked, the doors open. Valuables, including David's wallet and Robin's purse, were left inside, immediately ruling out robbery as a primary motive. The keys were gone. It was another unsettling tableau of abandonment, meticulously curated to confuse police and imply the occupants had left willingly or been taken instantly. The killer's signature was the removal of the keys and the untouched valuables, signaling that the motive was purely power and control, not financial gain. This deliberate staging was the true link that police failed to recognize instantly. The removal of the keys effectively disabled the vehicle, ensuring the victims could not use it for escape, and making the scene appear abandoned. Local police initially refused to link the case to the Thomas Dowski murders. They cited the difference in the victims' backgrounds, the difference in the crime scene location, and the differing methods of attack. One case was strangulation and cutting in a small sedan. This was a potential shooting in a truck near a boat ramp. The police insisted, despite the desperate pleas of the families, that this was an isolated kidnapping, or perhaps a separate local incident. They were wrong. They were allowing the linkage blindness to deepen, giving the killer exactly what he wanted: a segmented, compartmentalized investigation. The lack of a unified task force allowed the predator to continue moving across the map unchallenged. The agonizing search lasted 2 months. The woods and waterways surrounding the James River were scoured by volunteers and divers in a desperate, futile effort. The damp, clinging chill of late autumn settled over the search area, mirroring the cold certainty growing in the community. These children were not coming home. The killer knew the remote terrain would destroy evidence. Finally, in November 1987, a hunter stumbled across the bodies of David and Robin, dumped deep in the woods near the refuge. They had been shot. David was shot once, suggesting he may have been killed first or quickly subdued. Robin was shot multiple times, another display of personalized, focused violence against the female victim. The forensic evidence, though degraded by the passage of time and exposure, was clear. This was not a chaotic crime. The violence was brutal, but the concealment was tactical. The killer had driven his victims to a remote location, executed them, and then dumped them in the dense undergrowth far from where their vehicle was found. This deliberate separation of the victims from their car was a terrifying escalation. It proved the killer had the ability to move his victims and control the crime narrative across multiple jurisdictions, using the vast, unmonitored dark territories of the region as his shield. He was demonstrating mastery over the region's geography and the investigative system's weakness. The 2 cases were now undeniable. 2 couples murdered while seeking privacy in isolated locations. 2 crime scenes staged to sow confusion. This was not a random act of violence. This was the work of a serial predator operating with a chilling lack of detection and demonstrating a deep, almost intimate knowledge of the region's most secluded corners. The Colonial Parkway killer had been formally announced not by a police press conference, but by the cold, definitive violence of his second attack, and the realization sent a wave of paralyzing fear through the entire historic triangle. No one was safe in their car. No one was safe in the dark. And worst of all, the authorities tasked with protecting them were utterly lost. They were chasing a phantom across county lines, constantly one step behind a killer who had already mastered the game of jurisdictional evasion. The initial failure to pool resources had just cost David Knobling and Robin Edwards their lives, solidifying the idea that the system itself was the killer's greatest ally. The search for the Dyatlov group began in earnest on February 21st. The first teams were fellow students, friends of the hikers, who knew the group's capabilities. They were soon joined by the military and experienced local Mansi guides. The operation was split into ground and air searches. Pilots flew over the vast, empty white wilderness, following Dyatlov's intended route. But they saw nothing. The landscape was a uniform, frozen desert. There was no sign of life, no signal fire, no dark shape of a tent. It was a search for a needle in a haystack, in the middle of a blizzard. The ground teams, meanwhile, were battling the same brutal elements that the Dyatlov group had faced. They were skiing into a desolate, silent landscape. Their hopes high, but their task immense. They were searching for 9 people in hundreds of square miles of unforgiving terrain. On February 26, 1959, after 5 agonizing days of finding nothing, a breakthrough was made. A searcher named Boris Sluptsov, a fellow UPI student, was skiing along the slope of Kholat Syakhl. He was off the intended route, investigating the passes that Dyatlov had intended to cross. He spotted something dark against the snow. It was the tent. But this was not the scene of a simple accident. The tent was not buried by an avalanche, the searcher's greatest fear. It was partially collapsed, yes, but it was sitting on the open slope, visible and filled with snow. The first, chilling and impossible clue was immediately apparent. The tent had not been ripped open by a bear or torn apart by the wind. It was sliced neatly with a knife from the inside. The searchers stood in stunned silence. This made no sense. They called out, but there was no reply. The tent was a tomb, but an empty one. Carefully, they began to excavate. Inside, they found a scene of baffling, suspended panic. All of the group's belongings were there. 9 sets of skis stood planted in the snow just outside. Inside, their warm coats, their fur-lined boots, their axes, and their maps were all left behind, neatly piled. Their food, including bread and chocolate, was laid out, as if they were in the middle of a meal they never finished. The hikers were gone. They had, in a moment of what could only be an unexplained compulsion, cut their way out of their only shelter and fled into the 30-degree night, leaving all their survival gear behind. This was the first piece of the forensic puzzle. This was not a natural event. This was the discovery of a locked room, breached from within. The question was no longer where are they? The question was, what were they running from? The searchers, friends of the group, were now investigators, facing a scene that defied all logic of survival. The cut tent was a scene of pure contradiction. The searchers, many of them fellow engineers from UPI, were baffled. This was not the work of an animal. The cuts were too clean, too precise, made with a knife. This was not the work of an outside attacker. The way the canvas flaps fell outward, and the location of the cuts, proved they were made by someone inside the tent, desperate to get out. And this was not a normal, planned evacuation. All the gear, the boots, the coats, the food, was left behind. Their maps, their compasses, their medical kit, and the warm clothes they had taken off to sleep were all still there. The 9 hikers had, it seemed, willingly and instantly abandoned everything they needed to survive. The searchers, standing in the deafening silence of the mountain, did the only thing they could. They looked for tracks, and they found them. This is the central, defining, and most impossible clue of the entire Dyatlov Pass enigma. Leading away from the cut tent, down the 1,500-meter slope toward the distant tree line, was a trail of footprints. The searchers, themselves expert trackers, began to follow. What they saw immediately destroyed their first most logical theories. They were looking for evidence of an attack, perhaps by the local Mansi people, or by escaped prisoners from a nearby gulag. But the snow told a different, much stranger story. First, there were 8 or 9 distinct sets of tracks. This confirmed the entire group had left the tent together. Second, there were no other footprints. None. There were no signs of a struggle. No prints from an attacking animal, and no boot prints from any other human beings. The 9 hikers had been completely and verifiably alone. This one fact, written clearly in the snow, forensically eliminated any theory of an outside human attacker. But the most baffling detail was the prints themselves. They were not the frantic, deep tracks of people running for their lives. At least, not at first. The prints leaving the tent were described by the first searchers as orderly, as if the group had walked, side by side, in a line, down the slope. It was not a stampede. It was a procession. And they had done so, shoeless. The tracks in the snow were not of boots. They were the impressions of socks, or a single shoe, or in some cases, completely bare feet. This is a fact that defies all logic of survival. These were 9 expert hikers, people who lived by the rules of the wilderness. They knew that in 30-degree below zero weather, removing your boots was not just a mistake, it was a death sentence. Hypothermia would be a certainty. Yet the evidence was clear. They had fled their shelter, leaving their volanki, their essential felt winter boots, behind, and had walked, barefoot, into a blizzard. The scene presents an impossible psychological puzzle. The act of cutting the tent implies a sudden, violent, life or death panic, a desperate need to get out right now. But the act of walking away in an orderly line suggests a calm, controlled evacuation, perhaps under some kind of compulsion or threat. And the act of doing it barefoot implies a state of mind that is not rational at all, a complete disconnect from their environment. These 3 facts are in total contradiction. They do not fit together. The searchers, their own friends, could only follow this grim, silent evidence. They followed this line of shoeless footprints for over 500 meters down the open, wind-swept slope until the tracks were finally lost, erased by the hard, wind-blown snow. The trail was pointing them away from the tent and into the dark, empty void of the forest below. The footprints were a map, but a map that led to an impossible question. The searchers, now acting as grim, reluctant investigators, turned their full attention back to the tent. If the track showed how they left, perhaps the tent would show why. It only deepened the mystery. They began a meticulous inventory, and what they found eliminated their most logical theories. First, this was not a robbery. A container holding the group's money was found, completely untouched. Valuables, including their cameras and personal journals, were all present. Second, this was not a direct animal attack. The searchers were on the lookout for a bear, but there were no bear tracks. There was no blood inside the tent, no fur, no signs of a physical, violent struggle. But the most baffling items left behind were the group's defensive tools. They were carrying at least 2 heavy axes, essential for cutting wood and for protection. In the face of a terrifying immediate threat, an axe is a formidable weapon. Yet, the axes were found inside, unused, still in their sheaths. A knife or knives had been used to cut their way out. But the heaviest, most effective tools for defense were abandoned. This is a profound contradiction. If you are fleeing a threat so terrifying it requires you to slash your way out of your own shelter, why not grab the axe that is right beside you? And then, there was the gear. 9 sets of boots, lined up. 9 sets of warm outer coats, fur hats, and gloves. In the Soviet Union, this gear was not just expensive, it was life itself. To abandon it, to willingly step barefoot into a blizzard, was not just a mistake. It was an act of pure self-destruction. This was not a rational evacuation. The investigators found a flask of brandy, untouched. They found chocolate and other food, laid out for a meal they were in the middle of preparing. This was a snapshot of a normal evening, interrupted by an unknown, overwhelming force. This scene painted a psychological portrait of a moment that does not exist in any survival manual. It was not a fight, as no weapons were used. It was not a logical flight, as no survival gear was taken. It was something else. A pure, irrational, and total expulsion. The tent was a locked room, but the mystery was not how did a killer get in. The mystery was what compelled the victims to flee out. The searchers were left standing in a silent, frozen tomb, holding a collection of facts that, when added up, made no sense at all. The scene at the tent was a complete forensic puzzle. The searchers, led by Boris Sloptsov and a student named Mikhail Sharavin, had a collection of impossible contradictory facts. A tent cut from the inside, all survival gear left behind, and a set of shoeless footprints walking calmly into a blizzard. They had no choice. The tent was a cold, empty tomb. The only clue, the only sign of life, was that grim trail of footprints leading away. They followed. The searchers, themselves hardened hikers, could not comprehend what they were seeing. The tracks led them down the long, gradual slope of Kholat Syakhl for nearly a mile, a full 1,500 meters. With every step, the hikers would have been moving farther and farther from their only shelter. With every step, the fatal, freezing wind would have been draining the life from them. And they did this barefoot. The physical reality of this act is a puzzle in itself. In 30-degree C weather, frostbite on exposed skin is not a matter of hours. It is a matter of minutes. These were not supermen. They were human. Yet, the evidence shows they traveled an immense distance over sharp, frozen snow. This wasn't a short panic dash. It was a sustained, inexplicable march. A seeming compulsion that overrode their most basic, expert survival instincts. The trail of 9 prints, which had started in an orderly line, eventually became more scattered, suggesting the group's coherence was breaking down as they descended. The tracks finally led the searchers to the edge of the forest, the very tree line that Dyatlov had, for some reason, chosen not to camp in. And there, under a giant, ancient Siberian cedar tree, the search party made its first grim discovery. This tree was a landmark, the largest and most obvious one at the edge of the forest. The tracks led directly to it. It was almost as if it had been a predetermined rendezvous point. The searchers found the remains of a small, desperate fire. The snow around the base of the tree was packed down, and a few small branches were charred. But the fire had died. Lying next to these cold embers were the first 2 bodies. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonashenko. This discovery was not just a tragedy. It was a new, baffling set of contradictions. First, the bodies. They were found dressed only in their underwear and socks. They were barefoot. This detail is deeply perplexing. It is a known, if baffling, medical phenomenon in the final, delirious stages of hypothermia. The victim, in their confusion, feels an irrational sensation of burning and begins to remove their clothes. They were, in essence, dying, and their own bodies were lying to them. Second, the fire. Starting a fire in a blizzard with green, wet branches and with hands already freezing is an act of immense, focused, and desperate willpower. It proved that, at least for a time, they were lucid. They were fighting to survive. Their hands were found scraped raw, torn from their efforts to break branches. This presents a profound contradiction. How can a person be lucid enough to build a fire, yet so irrational that they are taking their clothes off in the same fatal cold? And third, the tree itself. The lower branches of the cedar were all broken off, used for the fire. But the searchers also noticed that branches higher up, as high as 15 feet, were also snapped. And, in a chilling forensic discovery, a patch of human skin and muscle tissue was found embedded in the bark. This is the next impossible puzzle. The hikers had fled their tent, barefoot, for unknown reasons. They had walked a mile to this specific tree. They were intelligent enough to build a fire. But they were also, it seemed, desperate enough to try and climb it, with bloody, frozen hands. What were they doing? Were they trying to get a better view back toward the tent? Or were they, in their final panicked moments, trying to escape something on the ground? The scene at the cedar tree was a forensic nightmare. It presented a psychological profile that made no sense. The victims were both lucid and irrational, fighting for their lives while simultaneously taking their clothes off. The searchers, now deeply disturbed by what they had found, had 2 bodies, but 7 were still missing. They had 2 key locations: the abandoned tent on the high slope and this grim, failed campsite at the cedar tree, nearly a mile below. The logical next step was to search the vast open space between these 2 points. The search team formed a line and began to slowly, methodlessly sweep the open slope. The bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonashenko, while baffling, were at least explainable by hypothermia. The searchers were likely expecting to find the other 7 one by one, frozen in the snow, all having succumbed to the same terrible natural cold. They did not have to wait long. About 300 meters from the cedar tree, heading back up the slope toward the abandoned tent, a searcher with a probe struck a body under 4 inches of snow. It was the group leader, Igor Dyatlov. He was found lying on his back, his face pointing toward the tent. One hand was clenching a small, bare branch. His other arm was raised, as if to shield his face. He was dressed, but poorly. He had 1 boot on, but no socks, and no hat or gloves. His posture, even in death, was one of pure, grim determination. He was, it seemed, crawling his way back to the shelter he had fled. The discovery of Igor Dyatlov, Rustam Slobodin, and Zina Kolmogorova marked the end of the initial search. It was late February 1959. The searchers had found 5 bodies. The official autopsies were performed. The cause of death for all 5 was uniformly hypothermia. They had frozen to death. For the Soviet authorities, this was almost a closed case. A group of hikers, in a moment of panic or confusion, fled their tent, became lost in the dark, and succumbed to the elements. It was a terrible, but logical, conclusion. But this solution was deeply unsatisfying. It was not a solution. It was just an observation. It did not answer the most important question. Why had 9 experts fled in the first place? And most urgently, where were the other 4 hikers? Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles. They had simply vanished. The investigation was stalled. The official medical examiner had noted the small, non-fatal fracture on Slobodin's skull, but had dismissed it as a simple fall. The case was a collection of loose ends. Families of the remaining 4 were in a state of agonizing limbo. The search was officially, and frustratingly, called off as spring storms buried the mountain in even more snow. For 2 full months, the case went cold, frozen in the same ice that held the remaining hikers. The files were open, but the mountain was inaccessible. The student volunteers were sent home. The military planes were grounded. The mystery and the family's grief was suspended. This 2-month gap is a crucial part of the story. It allowed the official narrative, a tragic hiking accident, to settle. But the searchers, the friends of the hikers, were haunted. They knew that the evidence did not add up. The tent cut from the inside and the shoeless, mile-long walk to the cedar tree were not the actions of hikers caught in a normal blizzard. It was an anti-forensic scene, a set of facts that pointed not to an accident, but to a profound, unexplainable puzzle. The families, too, refused to accept the official story. They pressured the government, demanding the search for their children continue. It was not until the beginning of May 1951 that the snow began to thaw. The mountain slowly began to reveal what it had been hiding. The search parties returned. This time, they were not looking for survivors. They were looking for the lost. On May 5th, a team of searchers, including manside guides who knew the land, were following the meltwater. They were tracking the small streams and gullies, looking for any sign of human activity. About 75 meters away from the cedar tree, deeper into the forest, they found a small, snow-filled depression. It was a ravine, cut by a small stream filled with packed, icy snow. As they got closer, they saw the first signs. Scraps of clothing, a single torn piece of a windbreaker, were found in the snow. They began to dig. What they were about to uncover would change the entire investigation. It would take a simple, tragic story of hypothermia and turn it into a deep, forensic enigma. The first 5 bodies had presented a puzzle. The final 4 would present an impossibility. The searchers began to dig. The snow in the ravine was deep, packed hard by the long winter, and melted by the new spring. It was 10 feet thick in places. They were digging into a solid wall of ice and snow, following the trail of discarded clothing. And then, they found them. Buried under more than 10 feet of snow, they found the remaining 4 hikers. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles. They were not scattered. They were found piled together in the bed of the ravine, almost as if they had been placed there. The scene, like everything else in this case, was a set of baffling contradictions. They were found in what appeared to be a den. It looked as though the hikers, in their final lucid moments, had tried to build a shelter. They had laid down a bed of cut branches and small trees to insulate themselves from the frozen ground. This act, like the fire at the cedar tree, was a clear sign of a desperate, rational, and expert attempt to survive. They were fighting. But the other evidence found on their bodies told a different story. It pointed to a grim, chaotic, and inexplicable timeline. This is the clothing puzzle. The 4 hikers in the ravine were, unlike their friends at the cedar tree, dressed. But they were not dressed in their own clothes. They were, in a strange and macabre exchange, wearing the items of the hikers who had already died. Lyudmila Dubinina's foot was wrapped in a piece of wool, cut from the trousers of a hiker found back at the cedar tree. Semyon Zolotaryov was found wearing the fur hat and coat of one of the others. The hikers had, it seemed, scavenged clothing from their dead friends in a final, desperate attempt to stay warm. This presents a deeply unsettling forensic question. Did this mean the 4 in the ravine had survived for hours, or even days, longer than the others? Did they make it back to the cedar tree, find their friends already dead, and then take their clothes before retreating to the ravine to build a shelter? This logical, if grim, theory was the investigators' best explanation, but it was immediately contradicted by another, more baffling discovery. The hikers in the ravine were found with their own personal items. Semyon Zolotaryov was found with his camera still around his neck, under his borrowed coat. Alexander Kolovatov was found with his own knife. This makes no sense. If they were in such a desperate hypothermic state that they had to scavenge clothes, why were they still carrying non-essential items like a camera? Why did they flee the tent with its warm gear, only to end up sharing the clothes of the dead? The timeline was a complete mess, a puzzle that no investigator could piece together. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. The clothing puzzle was baffling, but the autopsies of these 4 hikers would be impossible. The scene at the ravine, with its strange den and scavenged clothing, was a deep puzzle. But it was the autopsies of these final 4 bodies that truly broke the investigation, turning it from a tragedy into a profound enigma. The first 5 bodies found on the slope had told a simple, if tragic, story: death by freezing. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrozdeny, was a seasoned professional. He expected to find the same for the last 4. He was wrong. The bodies in the ravine presented a medical puzzle that, to this day, has never been solved. He was looking at a set of injuries so strange they should not have been possible. The first was Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles. Outwardly, like the others, he showed no signs of violence. But his autopsy revealed a massive, crushing fracture of the skull. It was not a small crack, like the one found on Slobodin. It was an extensive, shattering injury to the temporal bone, a blow that would have rendered him unconscious immediately. Yet there was no corresponding external wound. His skin was not broken. But it was the bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov that presented the most impossible evidence. Both had sustained massive, fatal, internal injuries. Dubinina had numerous ribs broken on both sides, a symmetrical, crushing force that had splintered her chest. Zolotaryov was found with a similar, flail chest injury, a force so great it had destroyed his rib cage on his right side. And here's the central, forensic void. Vozrozdeny, in his official report, stated that all of these injuries, the shattered skull, the crushed ribs, had been inflicted without any corresponding external damage. There were no bruises. There were no cuts. There was no broken skin. The force, whatever it was, had been precise, internal, and impossibly powerful. It had crushed their bones like eggshells, but had not marked their skin. He stated, with professional certainty, that the force required to create these injuries was immense, comparing it to the impact of a high-speed car crash or the shockwave from a powerful explosion. He also noted that it was impossible for a human being to have inflicted this. A fall. This was the investigators' desperate, logical hope. But Vozrosdeny was clear. A simple fall from the height of the ravine into soft, deep snow could not produce such precise, massive, and symmetrical crushing force. And even if it could, a fall onto rocks or ice would have caused external injuries. It would have torn their clothes, broken their skin, and left massive, external bruises. This evidence was the opposite. It was only internal damage. It was as if they had been squeezed by an invisible giant hand, a force that passed through their skin without breaking it. The medical examiner was, in effect, signing a report that described a physical impossibility. This was the evidence that broke the case. It was no longer a simple story of hypothermia. The narrative of a tragic hiking accident was destroyed. The investigators were now faced with a new, baffling reality. Some of the hikers had not just frozen. They had been, by some unknown, unseen, and impossibly strong force, crushed to death. And they had been crushed by a force that left no marks, a force that did not belong in our understanding of the natural world. This was the overwhelming forces that the official file would later refer to. It was not a conclusion. It was a confession of profound, total confusion. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrosdeny, was now faced with a set of facts that did not belong in the same report. He had hikers who died of hypothermia, and he had hikers who died from massive, crushing internal injuries inflicted by an unknown, markless force. But his grim work was not done. The autopsy on Lyudmila Dubinina, the woman with the symmetrically crushed chest, revealed one final, baffling detail that would become the most sensational and misunderstood part of the entire case. Her tongue was missing. This fact, when it was later leaked, became the fuel for decades of dark speculation. It was a detail so grotesque, so seemingly violent, that it pointed to a human, or perhaps non-human, attacker. But the medical examiner's report, when read carefully, tells a different, less sensational, but more clinically strange story. Vozrosdeny noted the tongue, as well as parts of the soft tissue around the mouth and eyes, were missing. He did not, however, file this as evidence of a violent attack. Why? Because the hikers had been found in a ravine, buried under 10 feet of snow, in the bed of a small running stream. They had been lying there, in water, for nearly 3 months as the spring thaw began. Forensic science tells us that soft tissues, like the tongue and eyes, are the first things to be broken down by natural decomposition, especially in a high-moisture environment. They are also the first things to be scavenged by small animals, like fish or mice, that could access the bodies via the stream, even under the snow. For the investigators, this grim detail, while horrifying, was not a supernatural clue. It was a simple, if gruesome, fact of nature. It was a distraction from the real, central, and unsolvable puzzle, the internal injuries. And there was one more piece of evidence. As the bodies and their clothing were examined, investigators detected something else. Traces of low-level radiation were found on the garments of several of the hikers, particularly those in the ravine. This discovery opened a new, terrifying, and secret line of inquiry. What was a source of radiation doing in the middle of the Ural Mountains? This fact, more than any other, is what forced the Soviet state to immediately classify the file. It no longer pointed to an accident. It pointed to something else. Was this a secret military test? A weapons-related accident? The investigators had no answers. They were just left with another impossible, contradictory clue. The case file for the Dyatlov Pass Enigma was now complete. It was a collection of pure, forensic chaos. A tent cut from the inside. Experts fleeing their gear. Unexplained, impossible, internal injuries. And now, traces of radiation. The overwhelming unknown forces was no longer just a theory. It was a proven, undeniable, and terrifying fact. The evidence gathered from the ravine bodies was undeniable. The final 4 hikers did not simply freeze to death. They were subjected to a devastating, crushing force that broke their bones while leaving their skin intact. This forensic puzzle, combined with the inexplicable events at the tent, left the investigators with a choice: admit total failure or invent a cause. The Soviet authorities chose the latter, but their invented cause was so vague it became a permanent admission of failure. The initial investigation, led by prosecutor Lev Ivov, was abruptly shut down in May 1959, shortly after the autopsies were finalized and the radiation traces were confirmed. The answer lies in the psychology of the immediate aftermath. The slab would have fallen silently, instantly crushing the 4 victims sleeping beneath it, while burying the other 5 survivors under a suffocating weight of snow. The survivors would have woken up in complete, frozen darkness, buried alive, with the terrifying realization that their friends had just been crushed, and that the tent was unusable. In that state of panic, seconds count to die. The most efficient way to escape the suffocating weight and avoid being buried alive was not to struggle with the zipper, which was likely jammed or blocked. It was to cut a hole in the tent wall. This explains the cuts made from the inside, an act of desperate, immediate escape. Once outside, the danger they faced was extreme. They would have been shoeless, in minimal clothing, and facing hypothermia. Their training would have told them to retrieve their gear. But the tent, their source of warmth, was now a death trap, filled with snow and injured or dead friends. The psychological trauma of the event, waking up to the sound of collapsing snow and crushed friends, would have been overwhelming. The Dyatlov Pass enigma was now complete, a case defined entirely by the impossibility of its own evidence. It was an unsolved puzzle created by a vacuum of facts, a vacuum that would quickly be filled by theories, ranging from the plausible to the fantastic. The time for investigation was over. The time for speculation had begun. The file was closed, but the facts remained. The entire incident was a calculated impossibility. The 5 initial victims were hypothermic, yes, but they died fleeing their shelter in a moment of inexplicable, irrational terror. The final 4 victims had been subjected to a crushing force that acted from the inside out, leaving them with injuries only seen in catastrophic vehicle accidents. These 2 sets of facts, the irrational flight and the internal force, must be connected. The evidence points to a single terrifying scenario. Something sudden, brief, and devastating happened inside the tent on the night of February 1st. It was a pressure so intense, so immediate, that it forced the 9 experts to slash their way out, abandoning all logic and survival training. The force was enough to shatter ribs and crush a skull, but it was invisible, leaving no external marks, no footprints, and no sound. The Soviet conclusion of an overwhelming unknown forces is the closest thing to the truth we have. It is a scientific admission of the void. We have established that this was not a simple accident, but a profound, enduring mystery, defined by forensic contradictions. The orderly walk of bare feet in the snow, the abandoned gear, the unbruised, broken bones, and the traces of radiation. The case file is now complete. We have examined the expedition, the frantic search, the silent tent, and the crushing enigma of the ravine. In the final chapter, we must attempt to give this overwhelming unknown forces a name. We will analyze the modern scientific theories and decide which one best fits the impossible facts left behind on Dead Mountain. The case file is closed, but the puzzle remains open. The official verdict, death by an overwhelming unknown force, is our starting point. We have established the facts: the tent cut from the inside, the abandoned gear, the shoeless flight, the lack of external footprints, the internal crushing injuries, and the radiation traces. Now, we must put the theories to the test. Which one, if any, can account for all the impossible evidence left behind on Dead Mountain? The vacuum created by Soviet secrecy was quickly filled by sensational speculation. The earliest and most chilling theories focused on what could have driven 9 experts to act with such irrational, collective panic. These theories often pointed to an external, terrifying force. The first, and most enduring, theory outside the official investigation was the Mansi attack theory. This theory suggested the hikers had encroached on sacred hunting grounds belonging to the local, indigenous Mansi people. In a desperate act of territorial defense, the Mansi could have attacked the tent, driving the hikers out. This theory gained traction locally simply because the Mansi were the only other people known to be in the area. This theory, while dramatic, quickly collapsed when confronted with the forensic facts. The official investigation questioned several Mansi individuals and found no evidence of involvement. More importantly, the snow itself provided a perfect defense against the theory. The footprints leading away from the tent were only those of the 9 hikers. There were no foreign footprints, no signs of snowshoes or boots belonging to another group. The snow was a clean slate, forensically proving the 9 hikers were completely alone when they fled their shelter. Furthermore, the nature of the internal injuries, massive, symmetrical crushing, was inconsistent with any known weapon used by the Mansi. The second theory, fueled by the Cold War atmosphere and the classified files, was the military test theory. This theorized that the hikers had wandered into a secret military testing zone, perhaps accidentally triggering an experimental bomb, a new sonic weapon, or a highly toxic substance. The logic here is compelling, as the Soviet government's sudden and aggressive secrecy is difficult to explain with a simple hiking accident. This theory offers a logical explanation for 2 of the most baffling pieces of evidence: massive, crushing internal injuries, consistent with a blast wave or rapid pressure change, and the low-level radiation found on the clothing. An experimental weapon or a collapsing military structure could certainly produce those results. However, it fails to explain the nature of the flight. Why would the survivors, if they were lucid enough to flee, not use their axes for defense or grab their coats? The theory explains the death, but not the illogical flight from the tent, which remains the central contradiction of the entire enigma. It asks us to believe that the blast killed 3 instantly, but the other 6 then calmly walked a mile to a tree. A scenario that is psychologically inconsistent with a high-stakes, panicked explosion. If the military and local attack theories fail to explain the contradictory evidence, the focus must shift to environmental and psychological causes. We must look for a phenomenon that can produce both a sudden, irresistible compulsion to flee and a powerful, localized force capable of crushing ribs. The infrasound theory attempts to explain the flight. Infrasound is sound at a frequency lower than 20 Hz, below the range of human hearing. It can be naturally generated by powerful winds passing over mountain peaks and through specific geographical corridors. Studies have shown that prolonged exposure to low-frequency infrasound can induce severe physical and psychological effects in humans. These effects include deep anxiety, intense panic, uncontrollable dread, vertigo, and even physical nausea. A sound wave that cannot be heard, but only felt, could create the exact mass hysteria that drove the hikers to slash their way out of the tent. They would be fleeing not an external monster, but a sudden, terrifying panic generated inside their own minds. The terror would be total, yet invisible, fully explaining the irrational flight and the abandoned gear, as survival instincts were completely overridden by fear. However, the infrasound theory hits a major wall when confronted with the crushing injuries. While infrasound can make a person sick, it cannot shatter a rib cage. It cannot deliver the blunt force trauma necessary to crush skulls. It explains the panic, but not the death of the 4 hikers in the ravine. Furthermore, while the theory is compelling, there is no physical evidence, such as geological records, that confirms a powerful infrasound event occurred that specific night on Kholat Siakal. This leads us to the most complex, yet most widely accepted, modern explanation: the slab avalanche theory. This theory requires us to look beyond the initial dismissive judgments made by the 1959 searchers. At first glance, this theory seems too simple. Why would experts die in a simple avalanche? The initial searchers dismissed this possibility, noting that the tents were found on a mostly level slope, not below a steep cliff, and there were no large mounds of snow usually left by an avalanche. However, modern analysis, backed by detailed computer modeling and forensic examination, suggests a highly specific rare type of snow event: the slab avalanche. This occurs when a heavy, hard layer of wind-packed snow breaks off and slides down a relatively shallow slope, one that does not need to be steep. The slope where the tent was pitched, a subtle 23-degree incline, was just steep enough. Crucially, the slab of snow does not destroy the tent, but it would have broken loose directly above the tent, delivering a massive, instantaneous amount of weight directly onto the sleeping hikers. This single event logically explains almost all the impossible contradictions. The crushing force on the 4 victims' chests is consistent with a sudden, overwhelming weight of several tons of hard snow, and crucially, the slab would have hit the hikers inside the tent, inflicting the fatal injuries without leaving any external marks or bruising on the skin, as the pressure was uniform and distributed across the heavy clothing and sleeping bag. This explains the injuries and the immediate flight. The final key step is linking this pressure to the panic that caused them to cut their way out and flee. The slab avalanche theory offers the strongest physical explanation for the crushing injuries suffered by the 4 hikers in the ravine: a sudden, unexpected break in the snowpack directly above the tent, delivering a tonnage of weight onto the sleeping group, accounts for the shattered ribs, the fractured skull, and most crucially, the lack of external bruising. The force was immense, but evenly distributed across the canvas and the victims' thick sleeping bags. But a question remains. If the slab hit the tent, why did the survivors cut their way out and abandon their coats and boots? Why didn't they just dig their way out? The answer lies in the psychology of the immediate aftermath. The slab would have fallen silently, instantly crushing the 4 victims sleeping beneath it, while burying the other 5 survivors under a suffocating weight of snow. The survivors would have woken up in complete, frozen darkness, buried alive, with the terrifying realization that their friends had just been crushed, and that the tent was unusable. In that state of panic, seconds count to die. The most efficient way to escape the suffocating weight and avoid being buried alive was not to struggle with the zipper, which was likely jammed or blocked. It was to cut a hole in the tent wall. This explains the cuts made from the inside, an act of desperate, immediate escape. Once outside, the danger they faced was extreme. They would have been shoeless, in minimal clothing, and facing hypothermia. Their training would have told them to retrieve their gear. But the tent, their source of warmth, was now a death trap, filled with snow and injured or dead friends. The psychological trauma of the event, waking up to the sound of collapsing snow and crushed friends, would have been overwhelming. Their decision to walk down the slope toward the tree line, rather than try to dig out their boots from the tent, can be explained by a final, desperate calculation. The tent was on a dangerous, exposed slope, vulnerable to a second collapse. Their only chance for survival was the tree line, a mile away. The tragedy of Dyatlov Pass is a story of 3 stages. First, a rare, powerful slab avalanche inflicted the fatal injuries. Second, the surviving hikers made an irrational panic decision to flee the immediate danger. Third, they succumbed to the elements during their mile-long retreat, sealing their fate not by an outside attacker, but by the overwhelming combined forces of trauma, panic, and the brutal cold of the mountain. We have reached the end of the evidence. We have followed the 9 expert hikers to their final fatal camp, documented the silent discovery of their cut tent, and examined the impossible forensic evidence left in the snow. The facts are clear. A group of highly capable experts fled their shelter in a psychological state of total panic, and 4 of them died from an immense, crushing internal force that left no external marks. The official verdict of the Soviet Union was a profound admission of defeat, death by an overwhelming unknown force. Now, for the final and most important part of this investigation, we must analyze the theories that have filled the vacuum created by that secrecy. To be responsible investigators, we must put every theory, from the most sensational to the most scientific, to the test of the facts. We begin with the theories that fail to account for the forensic evidence. The idea that a Mansi attack occurred fails immediately. The clear, undisturbed snow around the tent and leading down the slope shows only the footprints of the 9 hikers. No other tracks were found. The snow itself is the single most powerful defense against the human attack theory. Next, we look at the sensational, popular myths. The Yeti theory, that an unknown hominid creature attacked the group, became a popular explanation in the West as it accounted for the crushing force. However, this theory fails on 2 critical points. First, it leaves no large footprints, no fur, and no signs of a physical struggle or defense at the scene. Second, a creature capable of inflicting such massive injuries would have torn the tent to pieces and left deep, recognizable tracks. The Yeti theory is a dark fairy tale, not a forensic reality. We must also dismiss the idea of interskirmish or internal conflict. The journals show no signs of tension or disagreement, and the footprints show the entire group fled together. More importantly, no human being, even under extreme duress, can inflict the kind of symmetric, crushing rib trauma found on the victims without leaving visible external bruises or defensive wounds. The crushing force was not delivered by a man. It was delivered by something external and immense. This brings us to the 2 core, fact-based theories that offer plausible explanations for the entire sequence of events: the military test theory and the slab avalanche theory. These are the 2 that directly address the contradictory forensic facts of the crushed ribs and the traces of radiation. We will analyze the political theory first, as it speaks to the atmosphere of secrecy that made this puzzle so enduring. The persistent secrecy surrounding the Dyatlov files ensured that the military test theory would be one of the most compelling and enduring explanations for decades. This theory suggests the hikers were collateral damage from a Soviet weapons test, a rocket failure, a sonic device, or a classified explosion. The atmosphere of 1959 Soviet Russia, a paranoid state obsessed with its arms race, lends enormous weight to this idea. The Soviet state had a history of covering up civilian deaths in the interest of military doctrine, making this a highly plausible political scenario. The military theory strongly explains 2 key, baffling facts. First, the secrecy and classification. A simple hiking tragedy does not require the KGB's immediate involvement, the sealing of the area, and the suppression of the files for decades. A military accident, however, would demand immediate, top-level obfuscation. Second, the radiation traces. Low-level radiation was found on some of the hikers' clothing, particularly those in the ravine. A failed missile, an experimental reactor, or a weapons-related explosion could certainly explain this radioactive signature. The source of the radiation was never definitively located or explained by the original investigation. The theory also attempts to explain the crushing injuries. A powerful blast wave, a rare, low-altitude shockwave, or even a piece of falling debris from a missile could have inflicted the internal blunt force trauma found on the final 4 hikers without leaving clear external marks. The force would have been immense, instantaneous, and invisible, precisely fitting the medical examiner's report. However, the military theory ultimately fails to account for the most fundamental contradiction in the case: illogical flight. If the hikers were subjected to a sudden blast or a terrifying event, the evidence doesn't fit the expected human reaction. In an explosion, experts would have grabbed their nearest coats and made a tactical retreat. Why did the 5 uninjured hikers not grab their warm coats and boots, which were lying right next to them? Their flight was irrational, not military. A blast would have caused disorientation, but the shoeless walk suggests an overpowering psychological need to flee that supersedes survival training. Furthermore, an explosion would likely have scattered the tent and left recognizable debris, which was never found. The tent was found with cuts made from the inside, not with damage from a blast wave coming from the outside. The military test theory requires us to believe that a powerful blast killed 4 instantly, but the other 5 survivors then calmly walked a mile to a tree, only to die of hypothermia. This scenario is psychologically inconsistent with the chaos of a high-stakes, panicked explosion. Moreover, the initial forensic timeline conflicts with the theory. If a missile test was responsible, the bodies would have been recovered quickly by military teams to suppress the evidence. Instead, the recovery was delayed by weeks, carried out by civilian students and teachers. This strongly suggests that the Soviet state did not know the bodies were there, and only ramped up its investigation after the initial civilian search reported the bizarre scene. While the military theory provides the most satisfying answer for the secrecy, it cannot logically explain the survival logic, or lack thereof, demonstrated by the 6 victims who died of hypothermia, nor the pattern of flight. The weight of the facts on the mountain itself points to a localized internal environmental force, not a high-level, external military event. The ultimate solution must be found in the physics of the mountain itself. The failure of the political theories forces us to return to the only physical suspect, the mountain itself. The slab avalanche theory, which seemed too simple for such a bizarre case, has gained immense scientific weight in recent years. This is the theory that truly unifies the core contradictions of the entire Dyatlov enigma. At the center of this theory is the tent's location. Igor Dyatlov, against his own better judgment and training, pitched the tent on a slope of a subtle 23-degree incline. Modern research, including a key 2021 study by Swiss scientists, confirms that this shallow angle, combined with the way the wind transports and packs snow in the Urals, creates a perfect mechanism for a slab avalanche. A heavy compressed layer of hard snow resting precariously on top of a softer, weaker layer. Crucially, this type of avalanche does not create the massive snow piles associated with a full mountain collapse. It breaks silently, often triggered by the very act of the hikers cutting into the snow below it to pitch their tent. The falling slab would have hit the tent, delivering the immense crushing force that killed the 4 hikers, but leaving the tent largely intact, merely bowed and buried under a layer of snow and pressure. This scenario perfectly explains the internal injuries with no external marks. The crushing pressure was uniform, applied through the tent canvas and sleeping bags, exactly matching the forensic report's description of a force similar to a high-speed car crash. The avalanche theory also directly explains the immediate flight. The surviving hikers would have woken up in complete darkness, suffocating under several tons of snow and trapped with their crushed friends. They could not use the zipper, which was likely jammed or blocked. Their only choice was to slash the tent open from the inside and escape the immediate danger of asphyxiation and being buried alive. This explains the cuts and the abandoned survival gear. In that state of panic and suffocation, grabbing boots or coats would have been a fatal, time-consuming risk. Once outside, the danger they faced was extreme. They would have been shoeless, in minimal clothing, and facing hypothermia. Their training would have told them to retrieve their gear. But the tent, their source of warmth, was now a death trap, vulnerable to a second collapse. Their only immediate rational refuge was the stable tree line, a mile away. The decision to walk down the slope was not irrational. It was a final, desperate calculation. The tent was on a dangerous exposed slope, vulnerable to a second collapse. Their only chance for survival was the tree line, a mile away, where they could find materials for a fire and build a proper shelter. The fact that Dyatlov and 2 others were found walking back up the hill confirms the gravity of their initial miscalculation. They likely realized the injured could not be moved, and they were attempting a doomed mission to retrieve the warmer clothes from the tent. The tragedy of Dyatlov Pass is a story of 3 stages. First, a rare powerful slab avalanche inflicted the fatal injuries. Second, the surviving hikers made an irrational, panicked decision to flee the immediate danger. Third, they succumbed to the elements during their mile-long retreat, sealing their fate not by an outside attacker, but by the overwhelming combined forces of trauma, panic, and the brutal cold of the mountain. The Dyatlov Pass Enigma, when viewed through the lens of modern snow physics and human psychology under extreme duress, begins to resolve itself into a devastating but logical chain of events. But 2 final contradictions remain that must be addressed to fully close the file: the radiation and the bizarre missing tongue. These final 2 pieces of evidence are what kept the mystery alive for 60 years. The slab avalanche theory accounts for the shattered ribs, the lack of external marks, and the panicked flight. It provides a logical framework for the entire event. But the Dyatlov case is defined by the sensational details. To fully close the file for plain sight docs, we must resolve the final 2 highly publicized contradictions: the missing tongue and the traces of radiation. We start with the missing tongue. This detail, found on the body of Lyudmila Dubanina, fueled decades of speculation about a violent, grotesque attack. The reality, while still grim, is explained by the conditions of the discovery. Dubanina's body was found buried under 10 feet of snow in a ravine, which was also the bed of a small running stream. Her body was submerged in meltwater for nearly 3 months. Forensic experts note that soft tissues, such as the tongue and the eyes, are the first to be broken down by natural decay and are the first to be scavenged. Water provides an excellent environment for this decomposition. More importantly, the bodies were found in a natural stream bed, which allowed small animals, such as water voles, mice, and other aquatic life, to access the mouth and eyes via the running water, even under the snow. The medical report confirms that the tissue loss was not a clean cut, but a breakdown that occurred over time. This gruesome fact of nature is a distraction. It is an issue of decomposition and scavenging, not an act of a human or supernatural assailant. The final contradiction is the discovery of low-level radiation on the clothing of some of the victims, especially those in the ravine. This single fact, perhaps more than any other, is what drove the original Soviet secrecy. A routine hiking accident should not involve radiation. However, modern analysis offers a rational explanation. The region around the Urals, even in 1959, contained several closed Soviet nuclear facilities. The hikers, being engineering students from the UPI, often brought their clothes on their treks without washing them for weeks. A much simpler explanation is that one or more of the students had previously worked in an industrial or university laboratory using radioactive isotopes, and their clothing retained traces of that contamination. This contamination was brought with them from the city, not inflicted by the mountain. The level was low, consistent with background or industrial contamination, and not lethal. This explains the radiation without requiring a secret military test, thus dissolving the final piece of the forensic puzzle. With the final contradictions resolved, we can now assemble the complete, unified narrative of the Dyatlov Pass enigma. viewing the tragic event through the lens of forensic science and modern analysis. The case is no longer an unsolvable mystery. It is a devastating chain reaction of rare natural phenomena and human miscalculation. It began with the miscalculation. Group leader Igor Dyatlov, perhaps delayed by poor visibility or simply seeking a challenging camp for the Grade 3 certification, made the fatal choice to pitch his tent on the exposed, subtle 23-degree slope of Kholat Syal. This exposed position was structurally primed for disaster. The very act of cutting into the snow to prepare the tent floor may have been the final trigger. Second came the silent impact. Late that night, as the hikers slept, the cold, heavy snowpack fractured, creating a slab avalanche. This slab delivered tons of weight down onto the tent. This impact was silent, instantaneous, and devastating. It was this pressure that inflicted the massive internal crushing injuries on the 4 victims, breaking their ribs and skulls without leaving any external bruises, thus perfectly creating the impossible evidence found by the medical examiner. The soft materials of the tent and their sleeping clothes acted as a buffer, distributing the force just enough to keep the skin intact, while the bone structure failed underneath. Third was the irrational flight. The remaining survivors woke up in complete darkness, suffocating under tons of snow, with the horrific reality of their crushed friends around them. Their primary expert instinct was to escape the suffocation and the unstable, collapsing shelter. They did not struggle with the zipper, which was likely jammed or blocked by the weight of the snow. They slashed the tent open and fled barefoot into the blizzard, abandoning the gear that now represented a death trap. This explains the cuts, the panic, the abandoned coats. The shoeless, mile-long walk was not irrationality. It was a choice made under extreme trauma. Risk hypothermia in a desperate race to safety, or risk immediate death by suffocation under the collapsing snow. Fourth was the doomed retreat. 9 hikers, some injured, all shoeless, made the rational decision to abandon the exposed slope and retreat the mile down to the safety of the tree line. The 2 uninjured hikers at the cedar tree started a desperate fire. This fire failed, but the remaining 3, including Dyatlov, made a brave and rational, yet ultimately fatal calculation. They realized the injured victims could not survive without immediate warm clothing. They attempted to crawl back up the slope to their tent to retrieve the essential boots and coats left behind. An act of true selflessness and expert triage. They succumbed to hypothermia, which was accelerated by the initial trauma and exposure. The evidence is clear. The overwhelming unknown forces was a rare, low-angle slab avalanche combined with a profound psychological response. The true mystery was not supernatural, but how this single physical event could perfectly account for every impossible, contradictory piece of forensic evidence left in the snow. The final question is how the Soviet state handled the scientific reality of the case. The tragic sequence of the slab avalanche theory closes the forensic puzzle. Yet, the story remains one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century because of the Soviet state's reaction. If the cause was a natural avalanche, why the decades of secrecy? Why was the file classified top secret? The truth is that the Soviet system could not tolerate ambiguity. The official verdict of an overwhelming unknown forces was a strategic choice. The authorities likely suspected the avalanche theory, but could not scientifically prove it with 1959 technology. They also had to contend with the undeniable presence of radiation on the clothes. While modern science points to industrial contamination, the Soviet regime, paranoid about its image and military secrets, could not risk any public association between the region and radiation. The official response was clear. Classify the file, seal the area, and end the conversation. They prioritized secrecy over truth. thus guaranteeing the legend would live on. The tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass is a story that exists in two versions. There is the myth, the terrifying tale of Yetis, military conspiracies, and dark lights. And there is the fact, a story of 9 brilliant experts who were defeated not by a monster, but by a rare, silent natural anomaly, combined with a fatal error in judgment and the most brutal conditions on Earth. The fear that drove them was real. The injuries were real, but the cause was physical, not fantastical. For decades, the truth was hidden in plain sight, buried not just under 10 feet of snow, but under a layer of official state secrecy and popular sensationalism. Our investigation, using modern forensic and scientific models, confirms that the most logical and fact-based theory is the environmental one. The final piece of the puzzle is not a monster, but physics. This has been the full forensic breakdown of the Dyatlov Pass enigma. If you believe that the most compelling truth is the one hidden behind layers of speculation and secrecy, and you want to continue examining the world's greatest mysteries with us, subscribe to Plain Sight Docs and hit the notification bell. Join us next time as we open another sealed file and search for the truth that remains hidden in plain sight.